Deployment of 4,700 federal troops in Los Angeles. Precedents, controversies, and political ramifications. In early June 2025, Los Angeles, the second-largest city in the United States, became the epicenter of a political and social crisis when President Donald Trump ordered the deployment of approximately 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines to address protests against a sweeping immigration enforcement campaign. This decision, made despite fierce opposition from California Governor Gavin Newsom, sparked intense debates about federal authority, state autonomy, and the limits of militarization in managing civil unrest. While not unprecedented in U.S. history, this action raises serious questions about its constitutionality, political motivations, and long-term impact on national unity. In this commentary, we will analyze the context, historical precedents, legal aspects, and political consequences of this event, while considering whether it signals a shift in how the federal government responds to protest movements. The protests in Los Angeles erupted on June 6, 2025, following large-scale raids by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) agency, targeting undocumented immigrants in predominantly Latino neighborhoods. Reports indicate that ICE detained over 118 individuals, including some with criminal records and others accused of ties to criminal organizations. However, human rights activists accused ICE of conducting raids without court warrants, with some legal residents reportedly detained mistakenly. In response to ICE's actions, hundreds took to the streets of Los Angeles, gathering at locations such as the Metropolitan Detention Center and industrial areas in Paramount. Initially peaceful, the protests escalated when some demonstrators blocked highways, set fire to autonomous vehicles, and clashed with law enforcement. According to the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, approximately 1,000 protesters surrounded a federal building, attacking ICE personnel, prompting the federal government to label the situation as lawless. On June 7, President Trump signed an executive order deploying 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles, citing the local government's failure to control the unrest. By June 9, this number increased to 4,000 National Guard troops, with an additional 700 Marines from Camp Pendleton placed on high alert and later deployed. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth emphasized that these forces were tasked with protecting federal personnel and property, warning that additional regular military forces could be deployed if violence persisted. Governor Gavin Newsom, alongside Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, condemned Trump's decision, calling it unconstitutional and a deliberate provocation aimed at showcasing federal power. California filed a lawsuit in federal court, arguing that Trump's override of the governor's authority to federalize the National Guard violated the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which protects state autonomy. Although a federal judge rejected California's request for a temporary injunction, a hearing scheduled for June 12 indicates that this legal dispute is far from resolved. The deployment of federal forces to address protests or riots is not new in U.S. history. Several notable past events provide context for comparison with the current situation in Los Angeles. On January 6, 2021, a mob of supporters of then-President Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol to protest the certification of the 2020 presidential election results. Initially, only 340 National Guard troops were deployed in Washington, D.C., at the request of local authorities. However, as the situation turned violent, Mayor Muriel Bowser requested additional support, leading to the mobilization of 100 local National Guard troops. That night, Acting Defense Secretary Chris Miller deployed an additional 6,200 troops from neighboring states to ensure security ahead of President Joe Biden's inauguration. This event differs from Los Angeles in that it occurred in the federal capital, where the federal government has direct authority. However, it demonstrates the federal government's ability to rapidly scale up National Guard deployments in response to significant unrest. A similarity is that both cases involve controversial decisions linked to Trump, whether as president or former president. In 2020, the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis sparked nationwide protests, including in Los Angeles. By June 3, 2020, 18,000 National Guard troops were deployed across 28 states at the request of governors. In California, approximately 9,600 troops were mobilized statewide, with 2,800 concentrated in Los Angeles after initially peaceful protests turned violent and destructive. Unlike 2025, the 2020 deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles was ordered by Governor Newsom, consistent with state authority. This highlights a key legal distinction from Trump's 2025 decision, which bypassed Newsom's objections to federalize the forces. In 1992, Los Angeles experienced one of the most severe riots in modern U.S. history, after 4 white police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King, a black man. At the request of the California governor and Los Angeles mayor, President George H.W. Bush deployed nearly 2,000 National Guard troops on April 29, 1992. This number later increased to 6,000, and by May 3, a total of 8,500 troops, including Marines and Army personnel, were present in the city. This precedent aligns with the 2025 situation in terms of the scale of forces and the presence of Marines. However, a critical difference is that the 1992 deployment was carried out with the consent of state authorities, whereas in 2025, Trump acted against Newsom's opposition. In 1970, protests against the Vietnam War at Kent State University in Ohio led to a tragedy when the Ohio National Guard opened fire on a crowd of students, killing 4 and injuring 9. Nearly 1,000 National Guard troops were deployed at the request of the Kent mayor, reflecting the role of local authorities in seeking assistance. This event serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of militarizing protests. While there are no reports of lethal force by federal forces in Los Angeles in 2025, the presence of Marines and military equipment raises concerns about the potential for similar escalation. The legal controversy surrounding the deployment in Los Angeles centers on 2 key issues: the president's authority to federalize the National Guard and the limits of using military forces for domestic civilian operations. The National Guard is a hybrid force, subject to mobilization by both state governors, under Title 32, and the President or Defense Secretary, under Title 10. Typically, governors have primary authority for state missions, such as disaster response, with states bearing the costs. In national emergencies, the federal government can federalize the National Guard, covering costs and placing the forces under presidential command. Trump invoked a provision in the U.S. Code allowing the president to control the National Guard in cases of rebellion against the government. However, he has not formally invoked the Insurrection Act of 1807, which permits the use of military forces to suppress riots when federal law cannot be enforced. This raises questions about the decision's legality, particularly as Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass assert that local forces could manage the situation. California argues that federalizing the National Guard without the governor's request violates the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states. Legal experts note that this is the first time since 1965 that a president has overridden a governor to activate the National Guard for civil unrest control. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 prohibits the use of federal military forces for domestic civilian law enforcement, except when authorized by the Insurrection Act or other exceptions. The deployment of Marines in Los Angeles, even under the stated role of protecting federal personnel and property, has raised concerns about potential violations of this law, particularly as Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act. Historically, Marines have rarely been used in domestic civilian contexts, except in major disasters like Hurricane Katrina, 2005, or the 9/11 attacks, 2001. The mobilization of Marines in Los Angeles, combined with the use of tear gas, stun grenades, and rubber bullets, creates an image of military suppression, escalating tensions rather than de-escalating the situation. Trump's decision has turned Los Angeles into a national stage for partisan divisions in American politics. Republican lawmakers, including moderates like Rand Paul, support Trump's actions, arguing that the federal government has a duty to intervene when local authorities cannot control violence. Conversely, Democratic leaders, including Newsom and California Attorney General Rob Bonta, accuse Trump of abusing power and inciting violence for political gain. Trump has made immigration enforcement a cornerstone of his second term, pledging mass deportations with a target of 3,000 arrests per day. The deployment in Los Angeles serves not only to control protests, but also to send a strong message to sanctuary cities like Los Angeles, which have policies protecting immigrants. Trump's statements on Truth Social, labeling the protests as riots and threatening further action, align with his law and order image. However, this move risks backfiring. Deploying large-scale forces without local consent could alienate moderate voters and deepen the divide between Democratic states and the Republican-led federal government. Moreover, accusations that Trump is using the protests as a pretext to flex federal power may erode trust in democratic institutions. Governor Newsom has leveraged the situation to solidify his position as a leading opponent of Trump. His posts on X, accusing Trump of militarizing the city and sowing chaos, have garnered support from progressive groups and immigrant communities. California, with its progressive tradition, has become a symbol of resistance against Trump's immigration policies. Protests have continued across the U.S., with thousands rallying in Washington, D.C. and other cities in solidarity with Los Angeles. This movement not only opposes immigration policies, but also condemns the militarization of protests, raising concerns about the erosion of civil liberties. To better understand the significance of the Los Angeles events, we can compare them to international cases where governments used military forces to control protests. For example, in Hong Kong in 2019, the Chinese government was accused of using excessive force to suppress pro-democracy protests, leading to a severe loss of public trust. Similarly, in Chile in 2019, the deployment of the military to address protests over economic inequality escalated violence and damaged the government's credibility. While the U.S. has a stronger legal and democratic framework, the use of Marines and National Guard troops in Los Angeles could foster perceptions that the federal government is resorting to authoritarian measures, undermining America's image as a beacon of freedom. The deployment of 4,700 federal troops in Los Angeles marks a turning point in how the U.S. government addresses civil unrest. While historical precedents exist, Trump's decision, with its scale and lack of state consent, raises profound questions about the constitutionality, ethics, and efficacy of militarizing protests. While the federal government argues that this action was necessary to restore order, critics contend that it reflects an attempt to showcase power, escalating tensions rather than addressing the root causes of the unrest. For a sustainable resolution, the U.S. needs a more balanced approach, prioritizing dialogue and reform over confrontation. Immigration issues, the underlying cause of the protests, require a comprehensive policy that respects human rights and addresses social grievances. Simultaneously, the federal government and states must establish clear coordination mechanisms to prevent crises like the one in Los Angeles from recurring. Ultimately, this event is a reminder that in a diverse nation like the United States, unity can only be achieved through mutual respect among government levels and citizens. Without it, the current fractures could become unbridgeable chasms, threatening the foundation of American democracy.